Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
All right, good afternoon, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of the Krulak Center, the Marine Corps University Foundation, welcome back to the Brewcast, which is our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast today for the benefit of our community of interest who can't join us live. So we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones off and your cameras off as well to help us stream the audio and the video from our presenter smoothly. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat function on WebEx. And once we conclude, we'll go through the questions in chronological order and try and get through as many as we can. So with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Dr. Brendan Valeriano. He is our Bren Chair for Military Innovation at the Krulak Center to introduce our today's speaker. So Dr. Valeriano, over to you.
Great, thank you, Major Brown. I want to welcome everyone, and I'm delighted to continue our series of Brewcast led by our Krulak Fellows. Today, we got a great scholar with us. We have Rosella Cappella Zielinski. She's an assistant professor of political science at Boston University and specializes in the study of political economy and security, a real critical area of research right now. She's the author of How States Pay for Wars on Cornell University Press, and her work can be found in various academic journals such as Foreign Affairs, Texas National Security Review, and War on the Rocks. I'm going to turn over the presentation to her, and I'll be leading the discussion afterwards. So go ahead, Dr. Zielinski.
Hi. All right. First, thank you all so much for having me. Honored, excited, thrilled, looking forward to having this conversation with you today. So I'm going to present this book project I've been working on for the last couple of years with my co-author, Paul Post, over at the University of Chicago. And you'll probably learn way too much about wheat during World War I and shipping, more than I ever thought I would. When I started this project on supplying coalition warfare. So this project really lies at this interesting nexus between military logistics and economic mobilization of a state's economy for war. And which, by the way, logistics is where I hope to get some feedback on today, since you all here know better than me. Logistics, the branch of military science dealing with the moving, quartering, and provisioning of troops, while it has a really vast and critical mandate, providing the resources of combat power, its focus is typically narrow, transporting resources, people, and material into theater, in battle, and sustaining throughout the course of operations. In contrast, when scholars and practitioners think of economic mobilization for war, that really focuses on this broad notions of how to mobilize a state's economy. Here we consider questions such as what degree should market prices determine the allocation of resources for a state's war effort? A topic near and dear to my heart, war finance. How do we pay for the war? Taxes, loans. So simply put, economic mobilization for war is really at this political level, whereas logistics lies more at the tactical and operational, and I think we could all agree should, if it doesn't lie at the strategic level. But supplying war lies at this kind of interesting nexus between the two. Supplying war, the acquiring, purchasing, and distribution of war inputs often just goes unrecognized for scholars. And I think because it lies between this political and military level, it doesn't get as much discussion, I think, by practitioners as I think it should. And it's important because leaders must reconcile the needs of the war effort, both war imports and ability to get those goods and soldiers in theater, with the needs of the civilian economy. Leaders want to keep the civilian economy humming along. We want to have low prices, goods consumption. That is an equally important mandate of any leader in office. And this whole construct gets fascinatingly complicated, as I've learned over the past few years, when you have to do this with your allies. We can go to the next slide. So the historian in me, even though I'm a political scientist, is going to read to you only two quotes through this presentation. In November 1939, President Roosevelt writes to the French ambassador, and he says, "In regards to war purchasing, I'm ready to handle the whole matter over here. If only we knew whom we were talking to. Our objective is the practical one. Number one, not interfere with our own military and naval program. And number two, prevent prices from rising in this country." And then he goes on, he's like, to meet these ends, what he wants. He's like, what is needed is one Frenchman and one Britisher in Washington who will have complete and final say for their governments. They'd have to meet once a day, put all their cards on the table, stop crossing their own wires, and give us a chance to just know what they want and when they want it. And I think this really gets at anyone who's worked at the strategic level of coordinating a multinational military effort, right? We often talk about unity of command, unity of effort, but we never really think about this in the construct of supplying warfare. And this is a problem because, sorry about that, you have to do a couple things. All coalition members have to balance supplying an ally or meeting the needs of their own military. But at the same time, they want to prevent an increase in prices to keep the cost of war low and support the civilian economy. And most importantly is coordinating good amongst allies who inevitably place their own respective needs first. And let me just say a couple things about coalition warfare. Coalition warfare is incredibly prevalent, and I don't have the stats with me anymore because I was going to read them off the slide, but since 1815, I'm saying what I can remember here, 40% of all coalition wars have been fought, 40% of all interstate wars have been fought as a coalition. Interestingly, if we think about how many major battles are fought as a coalition, between 1900 and 2003, 24% of all major battles have been fought as a coalition. The U.S., for its part, has been a member of a coalition since every war it's fought, I think since 1900, starting with the Boxer Rebellion. And I think what's most important is not only is coalition warfare prevalent, it's a big part of U.S. warfare. The United States often fights coalitions, but I think we approach coalition warfare what I call a NATO bias. We think about coalitions having pre-existing defense pacts. But in looking at all our major battles since between 1900 and 2003, my co-author on another project, Ryan Grauer, and I found that 60% of all of those battles are fought without pre-existing defense pact. So this idea that questions of supply are worked out ahead of time are actually quite false. And nor could that take into account all of the uncertainties that go with warfare. And let me just say a little bit about wartime supply problems. Because how a state goes about supplying the war, as I mentioned earlier, affects their domestic economy. Can affect, not always, but it can. Because purchasing goods for war first can affect prices and consumption. The government acts as a single buyer in the state's economy, maybe creating shortages, driving up prices for certain goods. And we have to remember that firms are not benevolent. They have interest in profit and arbitrage to get to that profit. And things that can be done to mitigate this, aside from obviously setting price ceilings, would be to buy from abroad. Okay, so maybe you don't want to create shortages at home. You're going to go elsewhere outside of your economy to procure war inputs, assuming that's available. Okay, war transport can also negatively affect the domestic economy, something I think we don't really think about very much. And it obviously depends on the nature, scope, duration, intensity of the war and where it's fought. But when you're procuring transport to get soldiers and goods in theater, often we use commercial transport. And commercial transport means unless those contracts are negotiated out way in advance, it's actually quite hard to get. Shipping is pretty inelastic. And what you're doing then is taking away from transport you would use for commercial interest. So instead of transporting goods, imports, exports for your economy, you're now using that for the war effort. So your economy is going to take a hit. And all of this, again, is compounded when part of a coalition. So let's say you need commercial transport to get your goods and troops in theater. That's fine. But if all your other coalition members need to do the same thing, then maybe they're going to be purchasing neutral goods and transport. And that's going to drive up prices in the global economy for the things you need, create a costlier war effort. And really the worst case scenario here is creating shortages amongst the different coalition members' war needs. So what can you do? Well, there are really three options for allies. The first option is, who cares? I don't care what my coalition members do, what my allies do. I'm going to just buy things on my own. I'm state A. I care about my needs, my citizens, my war effort. I want to stay in office. I want to keep everyone happy. I want to make sure we win our battles. We dominate in theater. So I'm going to go at it alone and, pardon my language, screw my allies. But there's a lot of cons here, as my previous comments alluded to. The con is if multiple states are seeking to acquire a particular resource, let's say you're competing for rubber, nitrates, oil. Well, that then creates this competitive increase in prices. And as I said, firms are not benevolent. They're going to have opportunities for arbitrage. Again, leading to increased prices, shortages at the front, you name all these potential problems that are going to happen for all the coalition members. Option 2. So maybe that doesn't sound great and you want to work more collectively as a whole and maybe organize economically more to the sum of your parts. So you can organize informally. You can share information to help other coalition members understand how their purchases, their transport fit into the overall coalition effort. Maybe you go farther. You facilitate the purchasing of goods together. You want to corner the market, act as a monopsony, set prices, and alleviate these market pressures. And cooperating informally could be you assign bureaucrats. Let's go back to the FDR quote. You have one Britisher, one Frenchman sitting in a certain location, or at least getting on the phone with each other to share this information. But one of the problems of doing this is that it's non-binding and can be easily violated. While it may be in everyone's interest to go ahead and do this, at any point, a country could be desperate. Maybe shortages are creating citizen unrest at home. You have food riots. Morale is low at the front. You're losing battles. Whatever it may be, you're going to have to violate this informal agreement and go at it on your own. Option 3. Again, going towards unity of effort, right? You can cooperate formally. You can act as a true monopsony. You can acquire the resources by doing that at reasonable prices. And you can make sure that these goods get to the state or front that needs them most. And cooperating informally means permanent organization. It means full transparency and sharing of resource needs, production that you have. It means you're going to put all your tonnage on the line and you're going to pull it and you're going to allocate it. And those bureaucrats who are assigned to doing that make the final decisions for their government. So the con is ceding sovereignty, but the pro is gaining a cheaper war that you can actually fight better. And so we look at this through World War I. Let me say a couple reasons why World War I, and I'll give you a brief overview of what this is going to look like. We wanted a case that was truly patient zero, in which there was really no pre-existing structures to dictate how this was going to go. Again, if 62% of major battles are fought by ad hoc coalitions, we want to think about what it means to throw a bunch of coalition members into the mix and how do they suss this out? How do they make these decisions of how to organize themselves and organize their wartime supply efforts? And so World War I was appealing. Allies fought together a little bit in the Boxer Rebellion, Britain and France in the Crimean War. But there's nothing going on prior to that. While the Entente is signed in 1904 agreement, there's no real military coordination at all prior to this. So it's a patient zero case. It's truly ad hoc. Also, it's a long war. It's an intense war, so it allows us to tease out what's going on with a series of supply shocks that I'll talk about in a minute. And they actually go through these different options. The war starts, they supply themselves, they go through a period of informal cooperation and then formal cooperation. And And I won't get it too much into this presentation, but what's really important here isn't just the need to organize better, but it's really this interesting story of dedicated bureaucrats with a lot of initiative who make this happen. And again, I'll talk about it in a minute. And so one more comment of why World War I and why the Allies and not the Central Powers. The Allies are all committed to business as usual. They're committed to non-status policies. They ideally want the market to decide. Yes, eventually there's rationing. Yes, eventually there's price caps, but they do everything under their power to preserve this relationship between government and business and the market. So they're a little bit unique in that way. And again, why wheat? Wow, never expected to be talking about wheat like this, researching wheat. So this is some data from the Chicago Board of Trade that we've been collecting, and we're currently collecting a bunch of data across all various wheat markets during the war. But wheat, again, American prices here, you can see compared to other commodities are more costly than everything else. It is a very costly commodity. Two, it has huge implications for shipping. I'll talk about this in a second. But basically, it's either you ship troops and goods in theater or you feed your people. It becomes this fascinating trade-off. And three, wheat at that time had a special place in all of the economies of the Allies. It was considered the most essential of all foods. It was eaten by all classes, so it held a special place. Indeed, you get bread riots in Italy, for example, and in other areas because wheat, again, more than any other commodity is important. Okay, so let's start talking about wheat, and then I'll get to shipping. So World War I breaks out, and wheat prior to that is very plentiful. You have an interesting wheat market that's predicated on purchasing things from abroad. There was a great line somewhere that I read that every 4 out of 5 slices of bread eaten in Britain prior to war onset was from wheat imported from abroad. So it's plentiful. Most wheat for the Allies is bought over from Russia. And while France does have wheat growing in the northern sector for various reasons, it still isn't enough to produce to meet its own needs. So in peacetime, it has to get wheat from Russia. And there are also French merchant marines are small relative to its import needs. So it actually during peacetime relies on British shipping. So this is going to be a recipe for disaster in a second. Okay. War breaks out. They think it's going to be a short war. Everything's going to be fine. This isn't going to last very long. Who cares about coordinating? Let's just buy wheat on our own. Things quickly go south. So the first thing that happens is the destruction and loss of northern France. As I mentioned, the French have wheat growing in the north, but we can, if anyone has been to France and has been lucky enough to tour northern France, especially battlefield areas, you'll see that it's pockmarked with things from bombs that have just destroyed the ground. You had trenches as well that destroyed all of that agricultural area. And it gets so bad that even when they kicked the Germans out, the amount of shelling that took place dug up all the subsoil that it was never going to be usable for the foreseeable future. They don't have nitrates because that's going to the war effort. They don't have the manpower because young men are now going for the war effort. And so while women and elderly and the very young work the agricultural fields, it's just not enough. So France now is going to be completely reliant on imported wheat. Again, wouldn't necessarily be a problem because they can get wheat from Russia, but then you have the closing of the Dardanelles. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, but all Russian wheat is cut off. So we care about shipping. All Russian wheat is cut off, you have to go farther afield. That you have to go to the North America and South America. Australia is too far. You're going to get some from India. You might get some from the French colonies in Northern Africa. But at the end of the day, it's going to be almost all American wheat, Canadian wheat, and some Argentinian wheat. So that is going to put extreme pressures on shipping, which again, all needed for the war effort. And you're going to get the blockade. Now, early on, the blockade really is a problem with insurance rates because the uncertainty in the market. So it's really going to drive up prices of shipping, drive up prices of wheat. And the Allies pretty quickly realize this is unsustainable, and they decide to cooperate informally. First, they create the, pardon my French, it sucks, Commission Internationale du Ravitaillement, the International Supply Commission, then the Grain Purchasing Committee, and then Portugal and Italy join, and then you get the Joint Committee on Grain Purchasing. But all of these are informal. These are phone calls that are being made. No one is fully agreeing to anything. They're not pooling their resources. Anyone can place any order on any market, and wheat is just becoming way too costly. And this goes on for about a year. Subpar, substandard, but it happens. And I just want to take a note because we're going to start getting more increasingly formal cooperation. And a lot of that is going to come from the French and French bureaucrats. It's going to come from two gentlemen, Etienne Clementel, the French Minister of Commerce, and a person that may be quite familiar to you, Jean Monnet. Both of them work Jean Monnet is part of this process since the beginning. He's actually the French representative to the CIR, the International Supply Commission, which I won't say in French because I'll butcher it. But they're not only are they driven to more formal cooperation because the French are such a precarious position, because they actually have a big picture for what they want Europe to look like. After the war, they're afraid of a German resurgence, and they want to economically balance against the Germans with the British and the Americans. So they're seeing the long game way before the rest of us are. Well, things go south really quickly. The failure of the Gallipoli campaign, there was some hope, even misplaced, that you could open up Russian wheat again to Western Europe. That doesn't happen. 1916 is going to be the worst crop year on record. And then you have Italian war needs. I'm not going to read it. I had a quote in my slides. So basically, when the Italians join the war effort, they basically need a lot of coal. They need wheat and they need coal. Both of them need to be shipped in. They don't have any shipping available. And that's going to demand even more shipping from the British. And then we start getting U-boat attacks. And while I'll mention unrestricted submarine warfare that takes place and its effects later on, the big effects on loss of tonnage start in 1916. And we get the wheat executive as a result of it. And this is the first formal, truly formal organization, institution for the war effort. How formal? It's centered in London. It has permanent representatives from Britain, France, and Italy. And again, those representatives from France are Etienne Clementel and Jean Monnet. And it's a plethora of information. All the cards are on the table, as FDR writes in 1939. And I'll show you an example in a minute. Wheat production, wheat needs, purchases, as well as tonnage availability and needs. They have a subcommittee on tonnage alone as well. And their goal is big. They want to control from, as my husband would say, soup to nuts, right? The production, the producing market of wheat, all the way to the final destination and every step in between. And by the end of the war, they purchased for everybody. You can't be an allied country or neutral country in Europe unless you're purchasing through the wheat executive. They purchased for Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Holland, Iceland, Madeira, which, if I recall correctly, is part of Portugal. And they purchased, their scope goes beyond wheat to various grains. These are from their archives, their minutes that I pulled. North American wheat and flour, Indian wheat, Japanese flour, Chinese flour, South African maize meal, maize chop, North American maize, corn flour, cornmeal, and corn grits. And really what's most important is that they pool their wheat and tonnage. They're going to throw all their lot in the mix and say, okay, the tonnage isn't my tonnage, it's not your tonnage, it's all of our tonnage. Everyone's going to give us their needs, and we, the bureaucrats in this room, are going to decide for our governments and divvy up that tonnage accordingly. This is just some minutes. A picture of the minutes so you can see how much detailed information that they're getting. And this is a success. By 1918, the wheat executive had control over the buying of 77% of total exports from the 6 chief exporting countries. And I read this quote from an economist at the time, and I liked it. The executive decided for practically all of the open countries of Europe how much to buy, where to buy it, how to transport, and where to send it. But the story doesn't end there, because it's really, as I've been peppering it along this whole time, is a shipping story as well. The U.S. enters the war, and that just puts extreme pressure on shipping. To get the American Expeditionary Force across the Atlantic, I had some stats, but they're gone now, was just too much. It was too much that the Allies needed to further pull their weight. They need their shipping. They needed an organization that looked like the Wheat Executive that just did shipping, because the tonnage committee within the Wheat Executive wasn't enough. You get the Allied Maritime Transport Council. And this is from the Allied Maritime Council minutes that were over at Nara College Park that I pulled. And this is going to look very familiar to you. The purpose of the AMTC is to watch over the general conduct of Allied transport. Number one, secure the necessary exchange of information and coordination in policy and effort. All members of the Wheat Executive. Number two, adjust their programs of imports to the carrying capacity of the available tonnage and making the most advantageous allocation and disposition of the tonnage under their control in accordance with the urgency of war needs. Again, same as the Wheat Executive. Number three, permanent staff. The programs of import requirements drawn up by the Inter-Allied Executive Committees. Number four, most importantly, based on the model of the Wheat Executive. Because remember, these bureaucrats are figuring things out as they go. They're experimenting with different types of organization as they go. And they finally found one that works, and they're not just going to implement it for shipping, they're going to actually end up implementing for all commodities. So any food, munitions, raw materials, you name it, is going to be formed on this permanent representative formal organization model of the Wheat Executive. And that's just a quote from Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, President Wilson's advisor in 1917. And I'll start to wrap this up. Going back to the letter that I opened with, President Roosevelt's letter is actually in response to a letter that French Ambassador William Bullitt sent in 1939. And he writes, as you may remember, it was Jean Monnet who during the last war set up the Inter-Allied Purchasing Agency and the Inter-Allied Shipping Pool. I expressed the opinion, then to the French Prime Minister, that while Monnet would do excellently in Washington, it could be much more useful if he were relieved from the polite duties of the ambassador and charged with nothing but the business of supply. And again, this goes back to the idea we wanted a truly ad hoc case, because what happens during World War II is they basically call up Jean Monnet and they re-resurrect all of these type of organizations. And initially in 1938, almost at the end of 38, I don't have the date in front of me, you get the French Anglo Purchasing Committee. So they've learned their lesson. They've experimented. They finally found a model that worked, and they're going to base all of the inter-allied institutions during World War II off of the Wheat Executive. And actually, this carries on into the interwar period with the Supreme Economic Council. The Wheat Executive carries on for another year after the war effort, because the war ends, but these problems don't go away. You still have shipping needs. You still need to import wheat. Eventually, they get carried into the League of Nations, and there is a long arc into the European Coal and Steel Community with Jean Monnet and eventually NATO. So there's a long arc story of that begins with wheat in World War I and ends into the type of organizations we see today. And so I just want to conclude and note how important supplying war is and understanding how coalitions supply their war and coordinate their efforts. And I think for scholars, we really need to bring this into this conversation beyond just how one state mobilizes their economy. And I think if we care about coalition warfare, to have a conversation only about unity of command and the military component, I think misses a really important aspect of warfare. And just like unity of command or effort, formal organization of allied supply results in more efficient distribution of resources at lower prices. So this book manuscript, we're just editing it, is about done. And my next big project is all about fighting together. Why do coalition members fight battles together? And I'm going to hope to do some, I've been reading all this logistics literature, as I just showed with Joby Turner's book, to get into that. And I hope to there's so much logistics literature on why it's important, but not as much theorizing as I would like. So I'm hoping to go deeper into logistics and understanding how logistical capacity constrains and enables coalition members to fight battles together.
Great. Well, we love logistics here at the Marine Corps University, so to have you back for that. I'll turn it over back to Major Brown.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Valeriano and Rosella. Thank you for your presentation. So next week we're going to turn it up to 11 and have our first attempt at a panel with our non-resident fellows. So we'll be joined by Mr. James Fielder, Andrew Reddy, Sebastian Bay, and Damien O'Connell, and we'll talk about all things wargaming. So we hope to see you all then. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.